Hello, my name is Lilian Okibe. Welcome to my channel. Lately, I've been getting so many DMs from you guys asking me or like telling me that you'd like to start locks, but somehow like you don't really know where to start, like you don't know how to start locks. Starting locks is like the easiest thing that you can do. Like it is so easy, and there are so many different ways that you can start locks, and no matter your skill set, you're most likely going to find something that you can do. So in today's video, I'm going to be sharing with you guys 8 different ways that you can start locks to help you guys figure out which method that it will most likely be best for you. So if that sounds like something that you're interested in, then please keep on watching. I'm not going to be talking about the sizes, different sizes of locks. Whichever method you choose, you can decide to make any size you want. You can make your locks small, you can make them bigger, chunky, you know, that kind of thing. So I'm not going to be dwelling too much on the size. In one of my videos, I have a video where I shared with you guys how to choose the best lock size that will work for you. So if you are finding it difficult to decide what size of locks you want to go for, then I highly recommend you watch that video. It will greatly help, you know. So the first method we are going to be sharing today is twist, starting your locks with 2-strand twist. This is like one of the most popular methods of starting locks among DIYers. That's people that start their locks themselves, and that's because most people that have natural hair already can do 2-strand twist. So if you are starting locks, is really only kind of logical for you to just start with 2-strand twist, since most people are already pros when it comes to doing 2-strand twists. Depending on how tight you make your twist, your locks can eventually become really how tight you make your twist and how you maintain the locks. Your locks can be anything from really manicured and like tight to being really fluffy and like easy and free. So 2-strand twist is a very nice way to start locks. The only downside, and I would not consider this really a downside, but it just depends on you, is that when you start your locks with 2-strand twist, especially if you make your 2-strand twist tight, depending on how tight you make your twist, many people have the pattern of the 2-strand twist remaining in their hair for months. Some people, it can even be up to a year, so that's something that you may need to look into. And also, before your locks transition from being 2-strand twist to actually for the texture to fade away, for it to actually become locks, you're going to have people looking at you crazy like, what is she doing? Like, your hair is old, do a new style. Like, are you not going to take down your twist? That kind of thing. So you should bear that in mind. But your locks will eventually mature to be locks. Like after a while, you're not going to see the pattern of the 2-strand twist, and your locks will eventually get thicker and fuller, especially if you're not like retwisting and palm rolling too often. So the next method that I'm going to be sharing with you guys is starting your locks with braids, regular braids. This is a method I feel like is really nice for people who want the really neat look forever. Because just like if you have natural hair, you know that when you do 2-strand twists, your hair tends to get really fuzzy and frizzy way faster than when you do braids. So that's just how it is with locks. With braids, your locks will actually look really put together forever, most likely, and that's a pro. So if you're someone that you want to have locks, but you really don't want, you want to skip through that phase of having your hair looking really fuzzy and frizzy and all over the place, and you don't want to go to a professional to do any other method that I'll share later on in this video, then starting with locks is actually an amazing option, because your locks are going to look really manicured and put together for a very long time. Now that's a pro, but the downside to this is that your locks will not grow, like the individual locks will not swell and grow as thick as if you started with 2-strand twist. Now with 2-strand twist, 2-strand twist is not really as tight as braids, so it gives your hair room to like swell up and fluff up. And so if you start with 2 twists that are like this size, right, most likely as your locks mature, especially if you don't retwist often, your locks will most likely become fatter, and it can even be as fat as almost two times the size of the twist that you started from. I don't know if that makes sense. But with braids, your locks will eventually get thicker, but it will not get so thick, because when you're braiding your hair, like you are basically overlapping your hair really tightly, so there's really no space in the lapping of the braids, and that will make it difficult for your hair to swell and bunch up and coil up for it to eventually become fat and thick. So you're going to have your locks, number one, you're going to have your locks looking neat for a very long time, but your locks will also not really swell up and become fatter and thicker as much as if you do with twist. That's another downside. Then another downside to it, and I feel like this is something that many people, that this is what makes this is the thing that makes many people shy away from starting their locks with braids, is that the braid pattern will most likely never really go away. Like, you're going to have the pattern of the braids in your hair forever. Like, I've seen people with locks that are like, people that started their locks with like braids that are 5 years into their lock journey, and you can still obviously see the braids, the pattern of the braids in their hair, you know. So the pattern of the braids will most likely not go away, especially if you maintain. And another thing is, the pattern of the braids will most likely not go away. That's one. Another thing is, depending on the method you use to maintain your hair, you're kind of, if you want to have that uniform seamless look, you are going to be limited to a particular way of maintaining your locks. So you are going to, if you want to for your locks to remain consistent, you're going to have to maintain your locks by interlocking your hair. You cannot really retwist, because then the pattern of the new growth and the pattern of the locks, the hair that you started with, will not be uniform, you know, that kind of thing. However, you can start your locks with braids, and then as your hair grows out, you just retwist the new growth, and then as your hair grows out, you eventually cut out the hair that you had before, that's the braids that you had before, and then you have set of normal looking locks, you know. That's another option. But if you're someone that is starting with really long hair and you don't want to cut any form of your hair, just know that the pattern of the braids will remain in your hair for a very long time, and your hair will not swell up as much, and you're going to be limited to maintaining your locks with interlocking, and your hair will generally not be as swollen and as chunky as if you started with two-strand twists. So another method that you can use to start your locks is by starting with interlocking. Interlocking I feel like this is a method that people use to start their locks for people who want sister locks, right? But they're not willing to go to a professional, a sister locks consultant to get their hair done. Most of them tend to start their locks with interlocks, like with interlocking their hair. With interlocking your hair, you're basically taking your hair and like using a needle to tuck it in. You're most likely, you're kind of like tying your hair, something like that. There's a technique that they use. You can Google it, you know, and you guys will see so many videos on how to interlock your hair. But most people that do interlocking, that start their locks with interlocking, they usually have really small size locks, you know, and so despite the fact that their hair will not swell up as much, for the size of locks that they are going for, it kind of makes sense for them to start with interlocks, because if you do twist, the locks will merge really fast and they will not be so tight together, and at the end of the day, you're starting with really tiny locks. Before you know it, they're going to marry together and become really chunky. I don't recommend starting your locks with interlocking if you have not really done your research and you have not really mastered the art of starting with interlocks, you know. The thing about starting with interlocks is that your hair, if done correctly, your hair is going to look put together all year long because of the method. Sister locks is kind of like tying your hair against each other, and so it's a lot similar to braids, but just that they are really small, and the technique of doing it is actually way different, you know. So you should bear that in mind when you're starting your locks with interlocking. Now the next thing we're going to be talking about is starting your locks with sister locks. The method used for starting sister locks, I think, is like interlocking. I don't know, I've never seen a licensed sister lock consultant do sister locks, but from the look of the locks, I think they use a combination of interlocking techniques to get the sister locks, but they look basically the same. To me, I feel like the difference is that for interlocking, you're doing it yourself. For sister locks, you're going to a licensed consultant. I don't know how it is done, but they look very similar. And sister locks are usually very small, but you don't twist with sister locks, you don't braid with sister locks. There's a technique that they use for doing sister locks. Another thing about starting your locks with sister locks is that your hair is going to look neat. Like, your hair is going to look neat and put together all year long. Another method that you can use to start locks is by starting with instant locks. I'm not saying interlock, instant locks. This method, you're basically going to a loctician. You can do it yourself, but there's a technique to it, you know. But most times you go to a loctician and they literally make your locks on day one. This is the method. This is one of the methods that will have your hair looking like locks on the very first day. Your hair will definitely look like mature locks on the very first day. There's a method that they use if you are starting with like relaxed hair or hair that is not so kinky. What they do is they kind of like back comb your hair. So they comb your hair. Normally when you're combing your hair, you comb your hair, you know, down the length of your hair, but then they are combing their hair into the scalp, and then they use a crochet needle to like form connections, you know, just to lock the hair with a needle. This is actually the method. This is actually a very, very common method of starting locks for many people that you just don't want to go through the stress of starting with twists or braids and having people confused whether you have locks or you are just wearing a protective style. You want to skip through that phase. That is actually an option. You can start with instant locks, right? But the thing about starting with instant locks is that depending on your loctician and depending on their skill set and how tight they make the locks, your locks may not swell up as much, especially if after you've started your locks you tend to redo your locks very, very frequently. Starting with instant locks will not give you the thick, juicy, voluminous results as starting with twists will give you, you know. So yes, you're going to have your hair looking like locks on the very first day, but because your hair is basically locks by someone else, like you are not giving your hair the time to go through the locking process on its own and just swell up and freeze up and be itself, you know. Yeah, forcing your hair into a lock pattern. So most likely your locks will not be as voluminous, right, you know, as it would be if you just started with 2 strand twists and just allowed your hair to freeze up and fluff up and lock up on its own, right? And for many people say that starting with instant locks, the journey is not usually as personal because it's kind of like you have gone through the artificial routes. I don't know if that is true, you know, but I've seen several people say that because it's kind of like an artificial route, that kind of bond and intimacy of having your hair look crazy one day and the next day your hair is looking all put together, and like that journey of self-love and things like that, it's not usually as much when you start with instant locks as opposed to when you start with like a method like starting with 2 strand twists. So another method that you can use to start locks is starting with comb coils. This is another method that is very, very popular. Most people don't know how to start with comb coils. So if you want to start with comb coils, most times people usually go to a loctician to get their hair done. Many people that go to the locticians to get their hair done, especially for people who have more like coily as opposed to kinky hair, they usually tend to go for comb coils, and that's because I think because their coil pattern is already like spiral kind of, it's easier for their hair to kind of like maintain the coils, right, as opposed to starting with twists. I know there are so many people that have that kind of coils, 3C, 4A. I've seen so many of them that start their locks with comb coils. Now, comb coils are basically coils that are done with comb. So if you have natural hair, I'm sure you may have seen finger coils, you know. So it's like finger coils, only that it's done with a comb, you know. So you're just basically coiling your hair, and then you section your hair and coil it and just let your hair be for it to lock up on its own. The thing about starting with comb coils is that you're going to have more unraveling. And that's why many people that start with comb coils, their locticians usually tell them that don't wash your hair for a certain number of time. And that's because when you wash your hair, you tend to, because you started with coils, it's easier for your hair to unravel, like for the coils to come undone, you know. And that's why many people say don't wash your hair if you're starting with comb coils. So the thing about starting with comb coils is that because you started with coils, you don't have as much freedom to do whatever you like to your starter locks as much as if you started with twists, because twist is more like tight, you know. So it's a lot more difficult for you to unravel twists than for you to unravel coils, you know. So you don't have that much freedom to do whatever you like with your hair if you start with comb coils. Now, another thing about starting with comb coils is that you're not going to have that issue of having twist pattern in your hair for long. Like as your locks mature, they eventually mature into locks. Like you're not going to have that phase of where your hair still has the pattern of the twist, or if you start with braids, the pattern of the braids, you know. Your hair will basically just transition from coils to locks pretty fast. Like as soon as your comb coils, like your coils start to get frizzy, your hair automatically starts looking like locks. Like you're not going to have that twist pattern or any pattern whatsoever, because your hair was not plaited. It's going to be very easy for whatever pattern, for the pattern to fade away. You did not have any pattern in your hair to start from, and so you're not going to have any plaited pattern in your locks. So that's another point. I feel like this is one of the reasons why many people tend to go for starting with comb coils as opposed to starting with 2 strand twists, just because you're going to skip that phase of having the pattern of your twist or braids in your locks, and that will mean that your hair will start to look like locks much faster than if you start with 2-strand twist. Another thing about starting with comb coils is that because you're starting with coils, right, your hair kind of has more room to fluff up and swell up. And so depending on how you maintain your locks as your locks mature, you're most likely going to have a little bit more volume when you start with comb coils as opposed to when you start with 2-strand twist. However, how you twist your hair in the first place matters a lot. So if you twisted your hair really tight and you're doing those kind of like really rope twists, of course, because your hair is more confined and more constricted, it's going to be more difficult for that to freeze up and fluff up in the locking process. And so depending on how tight you make your twist will eventually determine how fluffy and how thick your locks will eventually become. I don't know if that makes sense. So yeah, you can bear that in mind. Comb coils is another great way that you can use to start locks if you don't mind unraveling from time to time. So another method that you can use to start locks is one of my favorite, but it's not my favorite, is the freeform locks. And the reason why I say it's my favorite is that this is actually the method that gives you the most volume. So with freeform locks, you're basically just leaving your hair from an afro. It can be a regular afro, wash and go, or a twist out, or just comb your hair out and let it be and just stop combing it and allow it to form locks as it so pleases. Now the thing about starting with freeform locks is that you don't have control over the size of your locks. Now even if you part your hair, as long as you do not like put your hair in a style, most times those parts will merge and things like that. So your locks will most likely have different sizes all over, and you're going to have some really Congo big locks, you're going to have some really small locks. Although this is not like a general rule, there are several people that if you start your freeform locks from bald head, your chances of having more uniform sizes of locks are much higher than if you start your freeform locks on an afro, you know. So basically, if you freeform locks, you do not plait or braid or coil or whatever, you just let your hair to form its locks from an afro. It can be an irregular afro that is just like combed out hair, or an afro that resulted from like a wash and go or like a twist out or a braid out or anything like that, you know. So that is how you can do freeform locks. Freeform locks will give you the most volume because you are not confining your hair into any style. So you're just giving your hair the freedom to lock up on its own, and so it's going to be really fluffy and voluminous. So most times freeform locks give you the most volume. Now on to the last method that you can use to start your locks, and this is my favorite method, and this is definitely the method that I used to start my own locks, and that is starting with the Lilian Okibe temporary locks method. Now the Lilian Okibe temporary locks is a style that I've been wearing. I used to wear when I was a loose natural, originated by me. You know, so it's basically a style that makes your hair, your natural hair, look like locks instantly without any crocheting or anything like that. They are basically braids, you know, but there's a technique to it. So if you just go ahead and braid your hair, it will not look like that. But the thing about that method is that your hair tends to start to look like locks on day one. So if you're someone that you don't know if locks are for you, but you just want to play with the idea of having locks temporarily and then just to see if you like it, you can do it, you can do this style. I'm going to leave a link to the playlist where I show you guys several tutorials up in the iCard. So you can do it as a temporary protective style. So you have your hair looking like locks temporarily, and when you're done, you can take it down. You can wear the style for up to 4 weeks as a protective style, right? Now if you want to start your locks with the method, you can also do that, but instead of taking it down after 4 weeks, you are basically just going to leave your hair like that to lock up like that for as long as you want, right? But the thing is, if you are going to be starting your locks with this method, I highly recommend that the base, like if this is your first time hearing me talk about it, I highly recommend that you go ahead and watch the tutorial so that you understand what I'm about to say. So if you're going to be starting your permanent locks with this method, I highly recommend that as you're braiding the base, I usually recommend that you braid the base kind of tight and then you start to braid loosely as you move down the length of your hair, right? But if you are going to be starting your permanent locks with this method, that section of hair that you braid tightly, you want to make it as small as possible, and you don't want to make it as tight as you would have done it if you were doing it to wear as a temporary protective style. Because if you make it too tight and too long, you're going to have the rest of your hair that was braided loosely will fluff up and thicken up, right? Then you're going to have that section of hair that is going to be so tight and so skinny, and then the new growth will eventually flop up. So you're going to have inconsistency in the look of your locks as your hair grows out. So if you do not want that, and I highly recommend that the base, you're basically just doing 2 to 3 wraps, but don't make it as tight as you would have done it if you were doing it to wear as a protect style. Make the base as loose as possible. If possible, just make everything loose. Like, it will still be nice. Your hair will eventually still form really, really nice locks. So that's the method I use to start my own locks. Now, the advantage of starting your locks with this method is that you're going to have your hair looking like locks on day one, right? And you're going to, and unlike instant locking where you're locking your hair, you're not locking your hair per se. Even though your hair looks like locks on day one, they are not actually locks yet, you know. So you're basically giving your hair the room to go through the full locking process, the budding, all the stages of locking. Basically, you're basically leaving your hair to go through those processes. So it's not like artificial and everything. You're still going to have that bonding of the locking process as you would have if you started with 2-strand twist. But unlike 2-strand twist, your hair is going to start to look like locks like instantly. And even as your hair matures, it's only going to get more, because when you start out, even though your hair looks like locks from a distance, like when you touch it, it's going to be like really soft and fluffy. But as your locks mature, it's still going to be fluffy, and it's still going to look kind of fluffy, but it's going to be more like, it's going to be harder, you know, that kind of thing. So as your locks mature, but you're going to have your hair looking like locks all through the period of the journey. Now, another advantage of starting your locks with this method is that because your hair is basically really, really loose, right? You're giving your hair enough room to swell up and fluff up, and so you're going to have way more volume when you start with this method than when you start with 2-strand twist. So your hair is going to be obviously more fluffy when you start with the Lilian Okibe lock method than when you start with 2-strand twist. However, with the volume comes more shrinkage. So you're going to have more shrinkage with this method than if you started with 2-strand, especially if you do it correctly. And now I highly recommend that, please, before you start your locks with this method, make sure you watch the tutorial, make sure you watch my tutorial, make sure you watch multiple tutorials of how I do the temporary locks, and make sure that you master it. If on the first day you can still obviously see the pattern of braids in your hair, you have not done it correctly. And if you do not do it correctly, you're going to have issues along the line as your locks mature. So please, and please, before you start this method, make sure you watch my temporary locks tutorial, multiple of the tutorials. Master the art of doing temporary locks. Make sure that when you start your locks, your hair, you can, from the very first day, you can hardly see the pattern of the braids. Even when you come really, really close, you can hardly see the pattern of the braids. Then you know you have done it correctly. Whether from the roots to the end of the hair, you can hardly see the pattern of the braids. That's how you know that you have done it correctly, and that's how you're going to get like really nice, fluffy, and juicy results like I do, like I have right now, you know. So like I was saying, with this method, you're going to have way much more shrinkage. So if you're someone that you really want to maintain the length of your hair as your locks mature, eventually your hair will shrink, whether you start with twist or any method that you use. But with this temporary locks method, you're going to have more shrinkage when you start with this method than when you start with 2-strand twist. Now, another thing to bear in mind is that your hair is going to look frizzy faster. You know, your hair is going to look frizzy way faster with this method than when you start with 2-strand twist, obviously, because it's loose, so your hair has more room to like frizz up and fluff up and things like that. But with the frizz also comes the locking process, so your hair is going to lock way faster with this method than your hair will lock up with the when you start with 2-strand twist. So as my hair is just 3 months old, and like my hair is already like really locks. Like if I touch my hair, like they are pretty firm. My locks are pretty firm at this moment, and even no matter how close you come, you can hardly see any form of pattern or any form of texture. My hair literally look like locks at this point, you know. So that's another advantage of starting with this method. I feel like this is actually my favorite method, because with the look I intend to go for, I want like really big, fluffy volume, you know, and so this method gives me all that. Yes, I have more shrinkage, but I really don't mind my shrinkage. After a while, your hair will eventually grow out. Now, depending on how you choose to maintain your hair as your locks mature, you can have this looking really fluffy and like afro-y, or you can have it looking really manicured and like really put together. So it all depends on how you choose to maintain it after you have started your locks with the method, you know. But personally, I like the really big fluffy look, and that's why my hair is like this, and that's why I did not retwist with the like how many people retwist their hair, because I'm trying to maintain the volume. But you don't have to do this. If you want the more manicured look, you can eventually retwist how many people retwist their hairs, and you're still going to get the more manicured look and things like that. So yeah, that brings us to the end of this video. I think I've shared all the different ways that you can use to start locks. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And if this is your first time on my channel and you like to see more videos from me, you like to see how my locks progress and how they mature, then definitely subscribe and make sure that you click the notification bell so that every time I upload a new video you get a notification. Thank you so much for watching. See you guys in my next video.
Keep it up one more minute. Keep it up, you're so great. Standing, talking, you got me checkmate. No one's watching and nothing